All right, everyone. Thank you for joining today and welcome. It is my absolute privilege to introduce Lauren Denson. She is Chile Warm Springs Apache and works at NASA JPL and is an absolute privilege to work with. She grew up in Southern California with family across the Southwest. She is a Bachelor's of Science in Computer Engineering and Computer Science from University of Southern California. She is the technical group supervisor and quality assurance engineer at NASA JPL and manages a very diverse team that supports workmanship training for NASA's West Coast Manufacturing Technology Transfer Center. As you can imagine, extremely complicated work. The training, tools, technology, and tracking team develops quality and IT tools infrastructure and infuses new and emerging assurance technologies. Lauren has a passion for outreach and giving back to the community through volunteering as a lifetime Girl Scout, teacher's aide for her mother's kindergarten bilingual education class in San Jacinto, which must be adorable, and supporting ACES, the American Indian Science and Engineering Society. She's the co-chair for the Native ERG Employee Resource Group Nebula, Native Engagement in Building a Unified Leadership Alliance, and supports diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts at JPL. Thank you so much for being here with us today, Lauren. It's a privilege to have you.
Yeah, thank you. I am so happy to be here with you all. I'm open to questions. Kimberly is going to be my co-host today in monitoring chat. I'm on one monitor, as Kimberly mentioned. I'm actually in San Jacinto right now, which is in the Inland Empire Basin, close to Palm Springs, if you're familiar with Southern California. Down here, I'm later doing outreach with the Saboba Band of Mission Indians out here. So hello. I will go ahead and get started. So today, my topic, it's very exciting, coming from multiple hats. Kimberly mentioned my technical hat, some of the Indigenous outreach hat I wear, and I'll go a little bit more into my tribal role in some of the work that we have been doing with our employee resource group, ERG, and just my lived experience as an Indigenous woman. So today we'll talk about Indigenous engagement through reciprocity and being a good relative. And this background is of my homeland, the Gila Wilderness, which is celebrating its centennial this year, so very exciting, in southern New Mexico. Okay, so first I would like to start off with a land acknowledgement. And so just a light caveat here, land acknowledgements and what I have in blue there is always considered what I'd say is a first step in allyship in acknowledging, supporting, uplifting Indigenous communities, just recognizing historical context. I'm sure some folks have felt it's performative, and in a lot of times, in cases, it is, but it is a good first step to just starting Indigenous outreach, acknowledgement, and engagement with community. So this is in the context of where JPL is located. We acknowledge that JPL is located on the traditional homelands of the Gabrielino Chachamanga village, Gabrielino Band of Mission Indians, Kich Nation, Tonga, and other Indigenous peoples of the region. These lands, Tovangar, or the world, the whole world, in the Los Angeles basin continue to be the homelands of these Indigenous peoples of the region. We acknowledge that Indigenous communities across the world continue to face ongoing impacts of settler colonialism, dispossession, and systemic oppression. We stand in solidarity with them, recognizing their resilience, cultural contributions, and importance of centering Indigenous voices and perspectives in all discussions and actions that impact their lands, rights, and sovereignty. And if you're joining from, far away from JPL, or like myself, I'm currently in the Saboba, near the Saboba Band of Mission Indian lands, Cahuilla lands. You can see out here in the Southern California region. You can check out what native land you're on going to https://native-land.ca. All right. So, Dagote, she learned as a conse, she chiene, she ba chiene in the nation of New Mexico, she nantan nebula, Forties. What else? So, hello, as Kimberly introduced me, and in my language, Chihene, which is Warm Springs, Apache, meaning the red paint people. Chi literally means the red ochre paint. We're Athabascan speaking people. Our language and dialect is similar to Diné, Navajo. And so I'm learning my language. So a little about myself, as we've mentioned, my tribe is actually in the process of federal re-recognition, and we can talk a little bit about complexities of recognition. There's different levels of that, and some tribes are de-tribalized or not recognized depending on, cultural context, historical context, and if we're keeping it to the realm of North America, different portions of history happening to different people and who are descendants of or still thriving today. And so I am a tribal council member currently, and I also serve on our Ojo Caliente Restoration Society Council of Elders. And our traditional territory is in southern New Mexico. And so if you've been in the region, let me think if I could describe this right, up and across, or just south of Albuquerque in the southern portion, going straight down to Truth and Consequences and across, if there were no borders, down into Chihuahua, Mexico. So there's kind of a little quadrant down that way. Shiba, Southern California. And so due to, as I mentioned, like the Indian Relocation Act, trying to lure indigenous people off the reservations as a way to diminish resources and shrink reservation lands, my family had been migrating and moving up from Chihuahua, Mexico, southern New Mexico, and eventually across into Southern California. I grew up in the foothills of the San Gorgonio Mountains, which is actually where I am currently seated. And then, so that's a little bit about our family and being disconnected in a diaspora away from our people, both my mom and dad. And it's interesting, in Southern California, or in California, we have the largest population of indigenous people and diverse indigenous people, and that I would say is due to that historical context as well. So Shi'ize, my medicine, is plant knowledge, and learning from Shichi'ine, my grandmother. So my grandmother has historically been a healer. She plants her own medicine, still at 87, is still working on her plants, and we'll sometimes find her with a rue or a ruda, and she'll take that and stick it in her ear. She uses it for toothaches, earaches, medicine. And so I try in my way, as what you would say is an urban indigenous person living in Los Angeles, to practice plant medicine, learning identification, and similar climates and ecology to my traditional homelands is similar to the region actually by Los Angeles. As an Inde Izdan, Apache woman, I'm culturally responsible as a culture keeper in traditions, culture, ways of knowing, language, and passing that on. We are a matrilineal society, and so it's up to leadership of the women to keep those ways going and for generations to come. So as I mentioned, Shinandan Nebula, I'm a co-chair. My other chair is Aaron Yazzie, who's Dene, a system and mechanical engineer on the Mars programs. We serve as JPL's Native and Indigenous Employee Resource Group, as Nebula listed there, is a monster acronym, as we do in NASA, to serve and support our Indigenous communities, both across the agency, Natives at NASA. Since we're such a small community, we make it our business to know who's Indigenous, if they're around, if they need support, engage in outreach in our local communities, in our student communities. And what we've started to do a lot more of is culturally consult with programs, projects, investment initiatives, or calls to support in a good way. And what I mean by a good way is considering reciprocity, respect, all these elements in engagement and bringing along community. And that'll be a big theme that we'll talk about today. So I hope today in our objective, we'll break down the importance of respectful relationships with Indigenous communities, learn a little bit about tech. I'm not going to go deep into that. It could vary differently. There are different ways of knowing, and depending on the Indigenous community, there might be different um, customs, taboos, culturally significant items that could be similar but different, right? Dene, we say the Dene folks are like our cousins to the Apache. So there's different ways that we could interpret or practice in tech. So I won't dive a ton into that, but we'll give some light examples. We'll talk about some strategies, do's and don'ts for effective and reciprocal collaboration on climate change initiatives, or just really any sort of connection with Indigenous communities, and some existing resources so you can continue to learn. I will share the presentation after. So we'll go through some definitions, tribal engagement, building relationships, reciprocity, and collaboration, being a good relative, a couple of case studies, some do's and don'ts, and open for Q&A. So apologies for the eye chart. You could have a look at some just high-level Indigenous science terms. So as I mentioned, traditional ecological knowledge, tech. This is something that at JPL, we've been partnering with our Green Club to infuse more ways of Indigenous knowledge systems, practices, and beliefs that have adopted from generations and time immemorial, as typically through oral tradition, as it says, cultural transmission about relationship in balance with our earth, with our environment, with our plant and animal relatives. So that's a little bit on tech. There's Indigenous knowledge systems. We just went over a land acknowledgement, 7 generations principle, and trying to work towards making sure that we're thinking of protecting our planet or working in a way that benefits the next 7 generations, or thinking ahead into the future and not just the now. Indigenous stewardship, I've highlighted a few, just is some of the themes that we're thinking of here and what is meaningful and impactful to those Indigenous communities. As Indigenous stewardship, the practice and responsibility for caring for the land, natural resources in accordance with traditional Indigenous laws, beliefs, customs, ensuring the health, well-being in a reciprocal way, balanced way that is for the environment, the community, the overall wellness, without, I would say, taking too much, but is both mutually beneficial. Exchange of, so in reciprocity, exchange of resources, knowledge, benefits, where everybody contributes, everybody is giving and receiving in a cooperative way. So reciprocity is going to be a large element here. So again, I won't touch too much into all of these items, but just for the focus of this topic here and how we can ensure we're carrying some of those themes, especially reciprocity, into our ways of being, thinking, and acting as a way of service and support and uplifting communities. So in tribal engagement and building relationships, just some high level themes I was thinking about, and in actually talking with my family and what's important, and always doing the homework. I have jokes sometimes where, well, people could just Google it, get a start, and it's really hard to find where to start. But a good way is, just like we talked about with the land acknowledgement, is understanding whose land you're on, or whose um, whose ancestral territory was there. There are instances, as an example, where there might be an existing reservation, but that wasn't always the traditional lands a community might have been on. They might have been walked off into Oklahoma, or have had to historically move because reservations have been displaced. So understanding what community or communities are impacted, maybe by the work that you would hope to do, if there's any land restoration projects, or aerial projects, or any imaging you want to review, or why you would have interest in that area. Maybe there's some community that's there, or they're no longer there. Why not? Does this community have a relationship with the country they're in? or state. And so there's a complexity of federal or state recognition, or maybe they're not recognized at all. So I'll give you an example. In Los Angeles, I mentioned Gabrielinos. There is debate between some community that Tongva is a misnomer, that or a perception of Mission Indian and adopting the colonizer name of San Gabriel. And so within the Los Angeles region, there are at least 5 or 6 different bands of Gabrielino people, or Gabrielino Tongva, Gabrielino Dash Tongva. And so there becomes this complexity of tribal politics, resources of haves and have-nots, and so it adds to a little complexity of who to support. And in some instances, there might be communities that are heavily structured, that have cabinets, different departments, or some are very small grassroots with just some resources to self-govern. Maybe there's an elder council, maybe it's just a tribal council, maybe there's none of that. Maybe there's a 501(c)(3) as a nonprofit to support as a financial vehicle for a community. There could be all flavors of that, and so just trying to understand who and what structures are in place to support. And part of understanding community, there's some reflection work and self-work that should be done as well. And so something I didn't share, my husband, he is white, and he's Nordic and German, and in his relationship to me, there's different dynamics there, cultural, ethnic, levels of privilege, that when he's in spaces with my tribe, traditionally for us as a matrilineal society, and in our way, when families get married, they go off and start their bands with the women. And so he becomes a member of our people in my tribe. That's our traditional way. So that outwardly, for folks that don't know this, could be perceived as offensive if he's wearing regalia, things of that nature. And so it's really important to do kind of reflection of self in those spaces of in this scope of Indigenous people or people of color. Do you have a connection to community? Do you have friends in the community? Do you have relatives in the community? If have you worked with Indigenous communities in the past? Is there a power dynamic, a structure dynamic, especially if you're working on, maybe a research topic or co-ing on a topic? Will any of that come into play? That could be, could serve as an inadvertent hurdle, or I guess maybe the one way I could think of it is I hear the term Fed, and so if you're working for a United States federal agency, you inadvertently bring that Fed hat with you in relation to potentially a sovereign nation, and there's historical context there as a power dynamic. So things to consider in also doing that homework. How is your personal dynamic interfacing with this community? And then once you're able to kind of lay the foundation, the groundwork, and starting to build up what could be tribal engagement and starting relationship work, is reaching out. And there could be a variety of ways to do reaching out, depending on your background, specialty, comfortability level. As mentioned, I know I do a lot of volunteer work with Girl Scouts, Teacher's Aid, general, just lectures. There's lots of accessible outreach opportunities. We also table at powwows, and so powwows are typically a gathering of many nations. There could be private ceremonial elements, there could be public displays of regalia, which is traditional wear, or community dances that all people are welcome to do, or you can just come and socialize, get to know community in general. There could be existing, like I said, restoration projects. So in near Pasadena, the Gabrielino Shoshone Nation is partnering with the one Indigenous charter school in Los Angeles, Anahuac, to make a plot of land that was given for a land back initiative to that tribal nation. as a learning village in working on the land through a hands-on ecological connection with community, naming plants in Gabrielino, and I mean, even pulling weeds, some of that real love and labor that we had been invited to go and help and support and get to learn both traditional ecological ways of knowing, but also just meeting fellow people who are interested, engaged, supportive, and part of the community. There are also indigenous organizations like ACES, SACNIS, or NESB, other intersection SWE communities that you can go and support, as far as like attending regional conferences, or there might be mentoring programs, things of that nature. Again, just to be a helpful servant of the community and showing up for these folks. Another opportunity, if some of these tribal organizations have the structure, you can meet with their tribal council as a supportive community member. There might be elders to start building relationships. Some tribes have a website that say, get to meet us, or there might be flyers for open to the community type events. Again, like it could be learning plant medicine, or in general, just community engagement events, powwows. Those are typically items open to the public, or they will post that. Yeah. And so this is just a little picture of powwow, and then just restoring indigenous corn and different types of corn. All right, so being a good relative. So this is a picture actually of my elder council in Mimbres last year in our annual gathering. And so you can see we're all sitting together actually in our traditional homeland and discussing strategy topics. You can see some folks have a drum there and in practice song. And so reciprocity and collaboration, being a good relative. I can't stress enough that indigenous communities are distinct across the world. I mentioned earlier that like Diné folks and Inde folks could be like relatives. We're proximately located, we're very close to each other. And so there are similar practices, but we're still distinct people. And being a good relative could mean a different thing to different communities. I last week was at a conference, and I sat with a lovely Indigenous American Samoa young scientist, and we made a joke. I'm like, well, I'm an elder and I'm not getting up for nobody, and sat at a table. And she's like, well, in my way, we don't leave an elder alone. So she sat with me, which was lovely. I'm like, oh, that's nice. So again, like being a relative, there's not like a standard definition, but I like pulling this kind of high level from this Talking Circle blog. A relative does not exist as an individual person, but as a member of a family, community, clan, tribe, nation. Being a relative suggests having a responsibility to their people, to their land, to the animals, plants, trees, traditions, language, and teaching. So just, again, themes of how can I be a servant, helpful, and add to the overall wellness of community, or our environment, our plant relatives and animal relatives. So the first thing my dad said, he's like, well, early notice is good. I'm like, yep. So early engagement, early notification, early. That means at formulation of an idea, should start from the beginning. And so that's why the pre-work of building relationships helps to build trust and getting conversations started. I know from the work that, in addition, work that I do in my role as a technical manager in the ERG land, we've been trying to consult in building relationships, and it's a challenge to overcome, again, the Fed label, and just reaching out. It's not enough to have good intent and want to be helpful when there's this historical distrust. So, as you're formulating your ideas, hopefully you've started that work in building relationship, have a connection, and are able to start engaging community in these circles. And always think about how you can pay your community members, your PIs, co-PIs for their work. You want to make sure that you're aligning with the community's cultural values. So there might be protocols, taboos, items, colors, cosmology that could be significantly um, important, including language. So I've heard in language restoration projects, as an example, and in my band, it's we've been told you don't write it down, which is a challenge in restoration. So how do we work to align to be culturally, um, you know, re- um, support those cultural beliefs, don't dismiss them, but also be effective. And so we're walking in dual worlds, a traditional way and a modern Western way. And how do we balance those? We engage and align with elders. There's potential for meeting with medicine people. They might have different perspectives on some things, and especially like using technology, which goes into a little bit of enabling sovereignty. So data sovereignty is a topic, especially coming up with AI and machine learning, and having data like for projects like language restoration or mapping and connecting to land of language. um, who has control of that information? I think that's just an important topic, period. And when we allow and enable sovereignty, this enables, community to have full autonomy, control um, of their culture in that way. So we want to be able to uplift community through self-reliance. So that could be, workshops in teaching people these new technologies, GIS. I've seen a lot of great ArcGIS storyboards. And there's actually one that someone shared with me over chichil, traditional acorns in the Southwest that we used for food. And so mapping over in our territory, it's beautiful storytelling. And then thinking about long-term relations. And so we talked about pre-work. We want to make sure that pre-work is done. Maybe there's seed funding. I forgot to mention I'm the JPL Bridge architect in trying to, again, literally build relationships between, um, these smaller communities that might need a little extra boost in connecting with NASA. And so consider seed funding opportunities to lay foundation work in, and then planning for the long haul. So again, some of these entities might not have a whole ecological department or an expert. There might be one person wearing multiple hats. So resources might be scarce, or just they might be overprescribed. And so, how can we be supportive within that environment and be able to make sure that, our projects move successfully in a cooperative way? All right, so I wanted to share a couple case studies. And so the first case study, and sorry, this is just kind of a bullet of a few things that had happened. So in early January, I believe January 2024, there was a mission that was planning on sending remains, commercial mission, to the moon. I think it was about 70 cremains. And so the Navajo Nation president, Boo, um, spoke out very publicly and on many platforms, I would say calling out NASA for planning to do this without consulting with the Navajo Nation and desecrating the moon. And many tribes find the moon sacred and for different reasons. The Some other items of context there. This had happened once before in the 90s, and at that time, NASA apologized and said, "We will not do this again." So it happened again. This private mission, the Prenegrin mission, uh, by Astrobotic, the company, had operated, or well, obviously it's a industry partner. The CEO dismissed the concerns as religion, and that you know the act of sending cremains is a celebration of life, not desecrating the moon, and not one religion or entity owns the moon. And so the Navajo Nation pled to meet with the White House and requested that the mission be scrapped or paused. It was not, however. The mission did fail due to a propulsion error. And so they made the decision to allow the cremains to re-enter Earth's atmosphere and burn up. Um, when we discussed this, when this was happening at JPL, there were a lot of thoughts, I think, similarly, of just trains of thought of like, well, what responsibility do we have collectively as humanity in how we're thinking of colonization of space or ownership of the moon, and respecting different belief systems was a difficult topic, I will say. Um, the Navajo Nation president and the Navajo, there was a council speaker, Curley, had met with the NASA administrator, Bill Nelson, later, about a month later, to talk about how can we as NASA, an agency, do better, and bringing in Indigenous communities to consult early on if there are missions that could pertain to the moon or just any other topics, right? And so I'd say Indigenous people aren't opposed to traveling to the moon or traveling amongst the stars, but how do we do it in a respectful way? How do we ensure that voices are heard, um, and support these government to government relationships, and recognizing tribal government sovereignty and self-determination. And so I have a few notes here. You can take a look at that talk. And why I bring that up is this impacted something that happened in my experience. I'm trying to keep the, let's say, the mission and parties, sensitive to that. So enjoy my crazy AI art here. And so what's in a name? About the same time that this mission was happening, private mission to the moon with cremains, an idea had come up to name some spacecraft in a native language. About 5 months before the scheduled launch, this idea had come up. A PI of a university and a NASA Center project manager had this idea to name the units in an Indigenous language over the kind of related to the territory they were hoping to observe. So they Googled some words and landed on a couple. And so it was interesting in that they're like, okay, what's the next steps? How do we make this happen? And so they approached the Office of Inclusion, where they recommended to talk to the Indigenous ERG, the Native ERG. And so the next steps for the mission were unclear. It wasn't really like laid out in a process flow. How do we do this? We want to make sure that, we're honoring Native people. What was said is Native people's languages are dying, so this is the right thing to do. They had a casual meeting to talk over intent, the idea, if there was any connection to community, had they been talking to anyone, or where this came from, and all the answers were no, no, no. Let's just do it. It was a difficult topic, and then there wasn't, again, any guidelines, and so the risk of not having guidelines, people are creative, and so how do you come up with a process without any guidance? Why not invent your own? So we looked at some rules. What were the rules? And so another meeting was held to discuss what policies could apply. And so it came up to what felt like legal interpretation in naming and guidance and what was allowable, not allowable. It quite literally didn't say no cultural appropriation. And you would hope that folks would want to do the right thing, but that was hard to convince if you don't have, let's say, objective evidence of potential harm that could be caused to community, if it's just so abstract or just, not learned. It's not everyone's lived experience, and ideas, thoughts, custom, what's offensive, what's not offensive is different, right? Based on different Indigenous communities. And so we requested, do not do this. This could be potentially harmful and sensitive just based off of some of the words and language they selected. So they were trying to proceed. So then the incident was happening around the same time as the Navajo Nation had been speaking out against NASA. And so the concern was brought to the direction where the ERG met with the PI, Earth Science, NASA HQ, the Cultural Liaison Office, to discuss the idea, basically a redo. What is the intent of using this language, these people's naming for a mission with no homework, and what impact there could be? There were a couple other case studies that were published and brought up, and we also had referenced the um, the Bureau of Indian, or I'm sorry, the Department of the Interior's guide to renaming name places. And so there are some national parks and federal parks and BLM land that are offensive or racist. And so there's a really nice guide that kind of describes, again, engagement in community, what language impacts are historically racist, language and actions that could happen. And so how to be mindful of all of those things. And in all of that, it was brought down from Bill Nelson's office to recommend to not move forward with the naming without any of that pre-work done. And so at the end of the meeting, I think it was a good meeting. We discussed options for sharing science to Indigenous communities, engaging with communities, going to ACES conferences, collaborating with students as a way to really connect and give data back to the land, rather than what felt like a native mascot naming of spacecraft. That isn't a way to honor people, Indigenous people, in any way. So at the end, they decided not to move forward with the naming, and I think it ended in a good way, so that now we've identified areas of potential gaps and processes and ways to move forward. And so just kind of a quick summary of some do's and don'ts. So it's just reiterating, doing the homework, engaging with your partners or Indigenous networks that you have access to. If you don't, you can just start looking into those professional sort of chapters at your schools or local communities, professional chapters, engaging early in building relationships, engaging these leaders, elders, communities with ideas. Consider meeting basic needs. That could be infrastructure, transportation, food. Again, some of these communities are impoverished and they might not have access to internet, as an example. Listening and learning and sharing intentions versus defining an idea or concept for the community. I've been a part of some efforts where we're making sure, people aren't inadvertently acting as a savior for a community and assuming what these communities need. Don't assume that Indigenous beliefs are the same. As an example, with the eclipse, some communities believe it's okay to look at, some don't, mine don't. And so just being open to listening and respecting that there's a diversity of beliefs and taboos. As I mentioned, some infrastructure might not be possible. There might not be internet access. And so what are ways to overcome those things? Trying not to center self and feeling good about self. I have that conversation with some folks. There are things that are the right thing to do and uplifting others and not necessarily showcasing self. Assuming that your intentions are clear to others. Again, there might be historical context, localized context, or even context outside of your control, being part of a federal agency or a university. Already as a representative of that entity, that might be a setback for any collaboration that could start. So remembering those things. And then not tokenizing partners. It's hard enough being in spaces where in many Indigenous communities, unless you're at a dedicated Indigenous space, that you're the one and only often. However, that shows up in intersectional identities. And so it's important to check in, be sure that, folks are getting their needs met, that they're respected, supported, and you're working together in a cooperative, reciprocal relationship. And so some resources and recommendations. Again, you don't have to dive super deep into this. There's existing support at NASA. The natives at NASA were a very tight-knit community, open to supporting. Lots of curriculum, resources, books, YouTube videos, and initiatives that are out there. You can check these out later. I'll make a plug for the Indigenous Peoples Initiative. That's a small group at NASA who is helping in building training for engagement with tribal communities for remote sensing, as an example. And we're in connection with IPI as well. So yeah, there we go. I wanted to leave some space for questions and answers. So, Ijeje, gracias, thank you so much. I will stop sharing.
Wonderful, Lauren. Thank you so much. I feel like I always learn so much from you. So thank you so much for this time, and thank you for putting together this excellent, excellent presentation. I'm sure that folks have questions. I know that I have questions as well. I guess let me go ahead and kick it off. I am wondering if you could share some of your thoughts or perspectives. ABoVE is starting to wrap up. And for some of the folks that we've worked with on the ground in Canada and Alaska, we're thinking about best practices for, transitioning those relationships either to other projects or some of our other colleagues, or, wrapping up and having, an ethical and maybe just a thoughtful wrap up, making sure that we're sharing all the information that we've received in all the different ways. So can you give us some thoughts on even off the top of your head, what you think would be a good way to do that, or some thoughts about how we could do that?
Yeah, I think always, if possible, coming together to celebrate, I think, a wrap up, right, as an accomplishment. It could be like a community barbecue. I don't know if you're engaging with communities, but food is always a good way to get folks excited, celebrate, showcase all the wonderful work you had done, and open it up for folks who might not have been along the journey as you all had probably been, to gain continued interest and offer kind of a space for, I'd call it like intimate handoff. And that could mean, there could be some partners who might want to meet for the first time. There was a long time, I'd say, where there was pandemic and people weren't able to meet in person. And so you can offer opportunities to, like I said, have that handoff, education, outreach, showcase, and celebration of everything you've done.
I absolutely love that idea. And I know the ABoVE team does often have barbecues in Fairbanks. So we'll have to make sure that if anyone else is on the ground, that they have the opportunity to celebrate together. Does anybody else in the room have questions that they'd like to share? Evjani?
Yeah, great talk, Lauren. It was very nice hearing, probably this is my first time I'm hearing a perspective as detailed as you had given. So quick question. I'm more of a data scientist by profession now. So I do a lot of data science with, different groups of stakeholders. So you talked about data sovereignty. So if you can give some examples of what is it from your perspective we should do with the data that is generated, not only from the ABoVE project, but, for the future also, what should we keep in mind, or how can we engage with tribes, the indigenous people to, to make our data useful for them or help them with our data, or what should we do in broader question?
Great question. I think first, I think a good step is to kind of lay out the foundation or the pipeline of how data is captured, processed, and stored in a simplified way to convey to all audiences. I think, even explaining what an algorithm is to an elder, in my experience as the IT person for my tribe, having to translate complex data structures or systems or theory in a simplified lay term that isn't intimidating, maybe as a roadshow or basic conversational or visual way to convey the story of how again data is captured, period, is a good step. I know a big hurdle I go into is just general fear. There's fear of AI. There's fear of, how much data is captured, what is captured, and if there's consent. And so another step could be in what is informed consent and laying it all out. So it might be okay to use Amazon Web Services, but do they know what that means? Who controls that data? And laying out where it goes. And so there might be some cooperative agreements in what's okay and what's not okay. And so laying all of that foundation out could help reveal more ideas on what's okay to capture. So there might be like I shared with some language is okay to capture or write down, some is not. Maybe it's okay to be heard. And so audio files might be okay to capture. There might be some stories that are sensitive and only kept within certain families and others that are more broad. And so kind of laying out what's public or private too is part of that data capture. So I think overall though, like I said, I think some folks could feel intimidated. And so just offering a friendly, simplified way to dive into explaining, capturing data and data science and big data could inform and give ideas on how they could leverage that. And some communities are more apt to using Facebook. Some communities are tech savvy or less than tech savvy. And so you can get kind of a technical maturity within that community and understand what they're comfortable with. And then you can kind of tailor solutions to their level of comfortability and maybe recommend building up maturity. And again, depending on their technical capability or infrastructure, an app might not work. Maybe there might be another way to be able to serve the community in that way.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Other questions for Lauren? Okay, well, I am really delighted to be able to share this presentation out. Lauren, thank you very much for that. I know there's a bunch of people from the DOE who had an overlapping meeting who were intending to come. So I'm really, really glad that you've consented to that. Thank you.
Absolutely.
There were also a couple of slides that I was wondering if we could share with the ABoVE Science Team meeting, your do's and don'ts specifically. Would that be okay?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yes, please. Yeah. So I'm open to questions too later. If you're not comfortable bringing up questions, I'm a very open person and will answer the best I can. I do have deep questions like, why is that racist? Or I don't understand this. In my experience, this, all of it is, I'm open and welcoming to those questions. So throwing that out there. You can share my info too. I forgot to include that.
Thanks, Lauren. And, thanks again for all of the work that you do above and beyond your full-time job. This is a huge amount of work, and even the case studies really illustrate everything that you're doing above and beyond. So thank you very much for your time here, and thank you for being such an excellent person and part of our community.
Okay, thank you.